I first was involved with Amicus back at the university at Lancaster as a student university representative for Amicus back in 2006. I've been involved with Amicus ever since. I went on to the Northern Student Rep. Hopefully you know who Amicus are. They're death penalty charity based in London. We work with capital punishment and offices in America. Most of our work is we send interns. We also do casework over here, and we also raise awareness about the issues. The internship programme, as I say, I then started doing the student rep up here for the north. A lot of the training and speeches and talks are in London, so you are immensely fortunate, and I appreciated back when I did it to have Sunny and Peter here. And they do like the north, they come here every year. They're not just London central. And then I then became a committee member for Amicus back in the day when they had a committee, and I ran the internship programme along with the staff for a number of years, helped interview the interns before arranging them to go out there. I did my internship back in 2009 in North Carolina for 4 months with a capital defender, working with what's called a trial office. So I dealt with the investigations, went to see people in prison before they were on death row, so I didn't go to the huge state prisons, and I did, as I said, I did that for 4 months. We also are fortunate to have a former intern who's standing right at the back, named Sam, so he'll be able to tell you when you ask him when he did his internship, far more recent than me. And he and I are going to be selling Peter and Sunny's books at the end of the talk outside the theatre by the tables. Sunny has a fantastic book called Stolen Time. I'm not going to go too much into Sunny, but she is, as it says on the front, a remarkable woman. She's a hippie, always has been. And she has a remarkable story to tell about that. My only main story is Sunny and Peter. You may remember going back some years when we were in Manchester, and we did a talk at Manchester University, MMU, and they were catching a train to go to Cambridge, Oxford, so the elite, and then off to London. And we were staying in the closest possible hotel to a train station she could get, for a reason. And we were walking to the train station, not late, but, we needed to walk fast. And we weren't walking fast. And Sunny spotted a oak leaf on the floor and picked it up, and she held it up, and it was a true oak leaf, and she was remarking how lovely it was and how beautiful it was, and thought it very British. And I looked at Peter. Peter clocked the look and said, Sunny, we need to catch that train. And so then we moved quite quickly then to catch the train. Thankfully, we got on the train, otherwise I would have been shot. You would never have made a talk at the University of Oxford or Cambridge, and the staff organiser in London would certainly have killed me. So that's my experience of Sunny. Peter also has a book about time. What you will learn is Peter was on the Irish death row, and Sunny was obviously on death row in America. I'm not going to go into too much because they will be able to expand far more eloquently than I can. Both books are available for £15 each, or a bargain rate together at £25. Now, from memory, they're both signed. They are both signed, but I believe if we have time, there's no objection to personalisations on them as well. So grab them where you can. The only thing I will say is Amicus is a charity. We will be taking donations tonight if you are able to. And you'll have the website, which I no doubt you've all been on already, which is amicus-alj.org. And the ALJ is Andrew Lee Jones. Otherwise, I think you get sent to some Amicus, you get sent to all sorts of other websites. I am a local barrister at St John's Buildings. I used to do crime and family, I only do family. We have given talks here before at Liverpool, and what I would say is if anybody has any questions or wants to help set up a student organisation here, I don't think there's a student rep for Amicus here, so do let me know. My name is Matthew Carey, C-A-R-E-Y. You'll find my email address on my Chambers website, St John's Buildings. I'm sure they'll appreciate the traffic. And then you can email me and all of that, and I can always put you in touch with Amicus, the organisation, for further information. Peter and Sonny will also be telling you about the Peter and Sonny Project Centre, and again, I'm far nowhere near as eloquent as they are, so I'll let them address you about that. If anybody has any questions, both Sam and I are about afterwards, I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Matthew. Good evening all, and thank you all for being here. Can you all hear me? Good. Okay. Yeah. I cannot recommend Amicus strongly enough and the work they do. We go from here tonight to Manchester, where we speak tomorrow, 2 meetings in Manchester, and then down to London for Friday, where we have 2 talks, and the last one is in the evening time for the Amicus training weekend. And we strongly believe in the work that they do, and we would strongly recommend it. Everybody that we've met who has been an intern in the United States or wherever have all said that it was the greatest experience of their life. Okay, well, back in 1980 in Ireland, there was a bank robbery, and after the bank robbery there was the getaway car collided with a police car, and there was an exchange of gunfire, and 2 police officers were killed. I had nothing whatever to do with this. I wasn't even in the same county or region where it happened. But 12 days later, I was arrested and framed for the murder and robbery. Now, on the evening of the robbery, after the 3 raiders escaped, one of them was arrested on the side of the road, and when he was arrested, he told the police he had a bullet wound in his chest. And he told the arresting police officers that his friend had also been shot. The second man was arrested the following morning, and the third man escaped cross country, and the police gave chase, and the pursuit happened across the country. 2 days after the crime, the police officer, succeeding in apprehending the man, caught hold to him, spoke to him, and attempted to detain him, but the man struggled and got away and ran away across the fields and escaped again. Apparently he passed through the town where I was, and they arrested me and framed me for the murder and robbery. Now the reason for this is that I had a political background. I've been a political activist since I was 16 years of age. When I was 18 years of age, 1957 to 1959, I was imprisoned in an internment camp. That means I was in prison for nearly 2 years without any charge or trial under emergency legislation. So I was what they would call, if you know this expression they use, round up the usual suspects. So they picked me up and they framed me. Now the first thing they did when they arrested me and took me to the police station was they brought me into a room and they stripped me naked, and a number of detectives walked around me inspecting my body minutely, and I didn't know what the hell was going on here. I found out later they were looking to see if I had a bullet wound, because the man that had arrested me had told him that his friend had been shot. And they looked very disappointed. I knew that, but I didn't know why until later I discovered why. In any event, I was arrested at 3 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, 12 days after the crime had happened. They commenced interrogations at 4 p.m. and they interrogated me from 4 p.m. Saturday to 4:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, when they put me into a dirty prison cell with a police officer outside with a baton, which he kept beating against the metal door of the cell to make sure I wouldn't sleep. They took me out at 8 o'clock and commenced interrogation, and they interrogated me from 8:30 a.m. on Sunday morning until 4:30 a.m. on Monday morning, when they threw me back into the same cell again until 8 o'clock, and they took me out again and interrogated me till noon on Monday morning, when they took me under armed escort to Dublin and brought me before the Special Criminal Court, where I was charged with capital murder and robbery. Now the Special Criminal Court is a non-jury court which was established for the trial of political offences. I was remanded in custody to the maximum security prison at Port Leisha, and where I was held on remand until my trial. About 3 months after I was arrested, I received a copy of the Book of Evidence, and I saw therein that a detective sergeant was claiming that after 34 hours of interrogation I had suddenly blurted out these words. I know that you know I was involved, but on the advice of my solicitor I'm saying nothing and you'll have to prove it all the way. I never said those words. I didn't know anything about them until I saw the Book of Evidence 3 months after I had been arrested. Myself and the other 2 people who had been arrested were brought together and tried in the Special Criminal Court, and it was quite surreal really, because for the first 12 days of the trial the only mention of Peter Pringle was when they read the charges to me. After that they didn't mention my name for 12 days, and then eventually they started working on my case. And in the course of the hearing, the police officer who had accosted the man they were chasing, whom they claimed was me, was asked would he know the man again and had he seen him again. He said yes, he's in the court. He was asked could he point him out, and I'm sitting in the dock, and he pointed to the back row of the public gallery and he said that's him standing up there with his back to the partition, and he pointed to a man standing in the public gallery as the culprit. It was very weird because everybody standing beside this man moved away from him, and so he was left sort of standing like this on his own, and it was like something you'd see in a movie. He was looking very uncomfortable, and the whole courtroom laughed. But he wasn't detained, he wasn't arrested, and he was allowed to leave the court, and I was convicted and sentenced to death. And my sentence to death was on the basis that of a detective sergeant who had claimed I had spoken those words 34 hours after, which I had never said. And so on the 27th of November 1980, I was sentenced to be made to suffer death by execution in the manner prescribed by law, which at the time would have been hanging. And I was brought to Port Leisha prison, a maximum security prison, and I was put in the death cell there, which the appalling conditions there. There was no natural light, the windows had been blocked off. There was very strong, stronger than these fluorescent lights on all day and all night. And I was forced to be in the company of at least 2 prison guards at all times. The week before Christmas 1980, while I was there, I heard 3 prison guards discussing what role they might have to play in my execution. Now, there hadn't been anybody executed in Ireland since 1954. This was 1980. Now, there was a body of opinion that said that they wouldn't like to carry out the execution. But these prison guards had been told by the authorities that 2 of them would have to participate in my execution. And they were discussing whether they would be asked to volunteer or whether they would be ordered to do it. And of course, very important to them was the fact that they needed to get a bonus if they were going to do this work, which was outside of their normal work. And they decided that it had been described to them that what they would have to do would be that when my body would go down through the trapdoor of the gallows, there would be 2 guards underneath my body, 2 prison guards, and each of them would have to pull on one of my legs to make sure my leg was broken. Now that conversation happened in my presence and sight and hearing as if I didn't exist, as if I wasn't a human being. They were as close to me as I am to Sonny now. And it illustrates the reality of the death penalty. And we have spoken in many places, and we have met with many people who have been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death and have been exonerated. And everybody experiences something similar. The jailers are instructed not to speak to the condemned prisoner, not to get to know the condemned prisoner, for their own protection. Because you see, if you get to like a person or respect a person, it would be very difficult to cold-bloodedly take part in taking that person's life. That made me very angry, of course. I was already angry because I was wrongly convicted, but then this really enraged me. But it also did another thing for me which helped me, and that was that it made me focus on the reality that I was facing being executed. And to my surprise, I wasn't afraid to die, but I was terribly afraid that they might take away my dignity. I was very much afraid that I might not be able to die with dignity. And I determined that I would not allow them to do this. Now, they had me in prison physically, but they couldn't imprison my mind and my heart and my spirit, and I determined that those are the areas of myself that I would live in while I was in that situation. And that's what I did, and I got through it. Eventually, in 1981, we had an application for leave to appeal before the Court of Criminal Appeal, and the Court of Criminal Appeal refused my application for leave to appeal, so I had no appeal against the conviction and sentence. And the Court of Criminal Appeal set a new date for my execution, being the 8th of June 1981. 11 days before that time, the President of Ireland, on the instructions of the government, reviewed my sentence to 40 years penal servitude without remission, because they had decided that it would be politically improper for them to execute somebody at the time. It was a very, well, I don't know what the word is, a very awkward time for them. You had the hunger strikes in the north at the time. Bobby Sands had died and other people were dying, and people were not being executed in Britain or in the north of Ireland, but there were many murders going on, and they felt that if they were to execute somebody in the south, this would put them in a very bad light, so they decided not to execute me, but put me to prison for 40 years without any possibility of parole. They put me out in the general prison population, and that for a few days was euphoric because I could walk around and talk to people and get exercise much better than when I was in isolation. But that quickly wore off, and I was faced with the reality of my situation. I knew at the time I couldn't possibly face 40 years in there. I had the choice then of either killing myself or trying to prove my innocence. And killing myself actually didn't hold any horrors for me. It seemed a very reasonable role to take, except I knew also that if I were to do this, they would say I did so out of guilt and remorse, and I couldn't allow that. So I determined that I would try to prove my innocence. Now, I left school when I was 13 years of age. I was a fisherman on trawlers at sea. I had no experience whatever of the law, and there was no law library in the prison, so I had to figure out a way to get in legal law material so that I could study law. I had a friend who worked in a college, and she had access to a law library, and so she would photocopy sections of law books and send them in to me, and in order for me to get them, I had to have a covering letter from a solicitor because they wouldn't have had them into prison to me otherwise. So she had a friend who worked in the solicitor's office. Women are wonderful about getting through difficulties like this. Men push through in the belief that it's our right, so we have to have it. Women know better. And so she got her friend, and her friend then, she would bring the material into her friend, who would type a letter, covering letter from the solicitor, who didn't know anything about this. And she would then post it into me, and I would get the material, and in that way I built up my own law library, and in that way then I was able to study law. But then I found I couldn't study because my anger was such that I just could not manage to study. So I knew I had to try and relax. I got a friend to leave me in a little book on yoga, and I began to teach myself yoga in the prison on my own in the cell. Very difficult thing to do. Any of you who know about yoga and the various postures that are there, it can be difficult to get your body into that sort of subtle shapes to do that. And if you can visualize doing it in a cell on your own with the book, holding it up, looking at the postures, and trying to get yourself into that, sometimes I'd fall over. Sometimes it was very frustrating, and sometimes it was very funny. But I am a stubborn person, and I persisted. And my meditation improved. And gradually my anger abated sufficiently that I was able to study. And I began to study my case and to study criminal law in general and the Constitution. And other prisoners would approach me and ask me to study their cases. I kind of got a reputation as a jailhouse lawyer, which, by the way, is a derogatory term. And so I did. I took other cases, I looked at them, and I did what I could for other guys. And in the time that I was in there, nearly 15 years, I succeeded in putting 13 men out of prison. Because, not because they were all innocent, but because none of them had been imprisoned in accordance with due process. And I learned about the law. I discovered that I had actually an aptitude for it I didn't think I had before. Don't know where it came from, but it was there. And so eventually in January of 1992, I opened my own case in the High Court in Dublin, representing myself. I had no money, I had no lawyers. I had to prepare the case myself, file it myself, and go to the court and stand myself against the top lawyers for the state and argue my case, which I did. And I won the discovery of state papers, which they refused to give me. And after many, many motions to get it and whatnot, they eventually gave me some papers and an affidavit swearing that, from the Chief State Solicitor's Office, swearing that this was full discovery, which of course it was not. In fact, I got 3 affidavits at 3 different occasions telling me that they had given full discovery, and none of them were true. They were all lies. But amongst the thing I got was a photocopy of the police officer's notebook. The guy who had claimed on oath in the trial that during a particular, what he called, period of questioning, which I call interrogation, that I suddenly blurted out those words. I know that you know I was involved, but on the advice of my solicitor, I'm saying nothing, and you have to prove it all the way. Words which I never said and didn't know anything about until I saw the book of evidence. But when I saw his notebook, it was clear that he had written those words into the notebook before the period which he claimed I said it. And in his record of the period in which he claimed I said it, there was no note of them at all. So obviously they had decided beforehand, they had no evidence against me. How could they have? I wasn't involved. But they needed to fit me up. So they created this false evidence and they presented it to the court and they got me convicted. My case opened in January rather of 1992, and it ran to May 1995, and on each occasion the prison would have to take me up to the court under armed escorts, military and police, with sirens and outriders and all that wah 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 stuff come to the city cabins. And as far as I would put up my case on my own behalf. And eventually in January of 94, a human rights lawyer named Greg O'Neill, a wonderful man, he offered me his help and I took it. And together we put the case into the Court of Criminal Appeal. And in 1995, the case opened in 94, ran to 95, and in 95 eventually my conviction was overturned. Now, my conviction was overturned, but I wasn't released, because the state asked for a retrial. So I was remanded back in custody to the prison, on remand, now facing the same charges that I had faced 15 years before. The presiding judge on the Court of Criminal Appeal was a judge named Flaherty of the Supreme Court. Now, what we didn't know at the time until later was that he was a personal friend of the senior police officer that had engineered my training. And later, actually, he had to retire from the Supreme Court because of unethical practice in other cases. So he was a crook, basically. In his judgment, quashing my conviction, he did not find that the police officer had hurted himself or been economical with the truth or told lies or anything like that. He found that it was unreasonable to expect him to remember accurately what had happened in 1980. And in the same judgment he ordered a retrial. And if you think about it, how could it be a retrial? Oh yes, he also found that in the same judgment that I could not have been conviction but for the evidence of this man. So if this man, who was the only basis on which I could be convicted, could not accurately remember what had happened in 1980, how could it be a retrial? And the reason for the retrial order was to prevent me getting compensation. So that they would be off the hook and nobody would be publicly to blame for what had happened. So when I was released, I had no money, no job, no driving license, no passport, no place to live, no social security number even, because after I went to prison they had computerized the system and they didn't put my name in. I don't think they ever expected I was going to come out of prison. And so it was a difficult time to fit into society again. It always is for people who serve long periods out in prison. And where we host exonerees in the Sunny Centre back in Ireland, some of them who have spent over 30 years in prison, some of them who went into prison at 17, 16, 17, 18 years of age and spent 30 years and then come out into society without any help whatsoever from the authorities because they get nothing more than we did. We didn't get anything. You don't get it because we're an embarrassment to the authorities. So it was difficult, but I kind of managed. I got through. I used it disciplines I'd used in the prison, yoga and meditation. They got me through. And about 3 years after I was released, a miracle happened in my life. One day I got a phone call from an American lady who told me her name was Sunny Jacobs. And she was going to be speaking at a meeting in the town where I was 3 days later, and invited me to speak. I asked her if she was going to speak. She said at that time, I said, yes, I'm interested in that. Two friends of mine, and I heard a story, and it deeply disturbed me. I was deeply emotionally upset. I was weeping listening to her talk. It was shocking. And I knew I had to speak with this woman. I said that to her. We spoke. We became friends. We became more than friends. And we've been living together now on the west coast of Ireland since 2001. We're married. And we established a foundation called the Sunny Centre Foundation. And the website is sunnycentre.com, where we host people who've been wrongly imprisoned after their release, to help them to fit into society again, to help them to heal the deep trauma and hurt that's inevitably within them, to heal from the inside out, spiritually. And it works. Because they can trust us. They know we know where they've been at. We have experienced what they have experienced, and so we listen to what they have to say and we share with them. And we have a place back there where we have, what have we got? We have 3 cats and 4 dogs, 4 hens and 4 goats. We had 5, one passed away recently. We're getting another 2 goats now next week. It's a menagerie, but you know there's great healing with animals. And there's great healing for people who can get away from the environment in which deserted them and betrayed them and locked them up. And where they can find peace and tranquility and be in a loving, caring environment. And when we introduce them to people, we don't introduce them as this is John and exoneree. We introduce them as this is our friend John, visiting from wherever they're visiting. And so they can mingle and be with people in an ordinary way, which they haven't been able to do before. And begin to heal. And that's what it's about. And after they go away, we stay in touch with them and we continue the work we do. So I've spoken long enough. Actually, I haven't spoken long enough, but then we're curtailed with time. And I could go on for a lot more time, and there's a lot more to be said, but I can't just say it now. But, because we're told we have an hour. So I would like to introduce you to Sunny Jacobs. Thank you.
So for me, it was a bit different because I wasn't an activist when this happened to me. I was just a young mother. I had 2 children, and my husband, his name was Jesse, and he had, before I met him, he had been in trouble when he was young. And so when we met, he was trying to start a new life, and I was just kind of looking for a husband for myself and a father for my children so we could all live happily ever after. And that's basically was my only interest in life at that time. I had been to university, but I was having too much fun. That's how I had my first son. So, anyway. But I was, like Matt said, kind of the, peace and love and vegetarian. And I was the last person in the world that anyone would think would become involved with anyone or anything that had to do with killing somebody. But we took a lift with a friend of my husband's, whom he had known from prison. And I must say, I didn't check his driver's license. I didn't ask a lot of questions. He was just giving us a lift. So it got late. We decided to pull over into a rest area. I was sleeping in the back with the children. Jesse was in the passenger seat. His friend was in the driver's seat. And the police came to do a routine check of the area. no crime being committed, nothing at all. And so they said that when they looked in the window, they saw a handgun between the driver's seat. So they pulled open the door and ordered the driver out of the car and took his ID. Then they ordered Jesse out of the car and took his ID. I stayed in the back with the children. They took my ID too. And then before it was over, the two policemen were on the ground, were shot. When I heard the shots, I just covered the children. When it got quiet, I looked up to see if Jesse was okay. He was standing in the middle of the two cars looking shocked. And the other guy was running around the car with a gun in his hand, ordering Jesse to put us into the police car. And I said, well, you know, it'd be fine if you just leave us here. But he said, listen, this guy has just shot two policemen, and if we don't go with him, he may kill us as witnesses. So we just go with him, and we'll find a way to get away from him later. So we became hostages of the killer. As he was transferring us, actually, between the two cars, my daughter was only 10 months old. She was a baby. And my son was 9. And as they transferred us between the cars, he slipped and fell into a pool of blood. And that's actually when I saw the two policemen on the ground. So now we're hostages of this guy who's just shot the two policemen. He drives us away in the police car. Eventually, there was a roadblock, and he made this other bizarre decision to try to avoid the roadblock. And he made a sharp turn, at which point all the policemen at the roadblock opened fire on the car. They were shooting at the car until we crashed. When we crashed, they surrounded the car. They put him in an ambulance because the driver was actually the only one who was injured. He was shot in the leg. We were lucky we all weren't killed, really. And then they handcuffed Jesse. And I was just standing there with the kids, kind of watching what was happening, until a policeman came out of the crowd with his gun turned around the opposite way and hit and smacked Jesse in the head and smashed him onto the ground. So I went over and tried to cover him. And he said, you better get away from me because they're going to kill me. And then they surrounded me and the children as well with their guns. And even though I tried to explain that we had nothing to do with what happened, they wouldn't listen, and we were all arrested. So they put the children in a separate police car and said they would be taken to social services where they would be kept safe until everything could be resolved. Then they put Jesse in a police car and me in a police car, and they drove us away. But they didn't take us to the police station. They took us to an unused portion of the railroad track, where they got out of their cars and they started arguing among themselves whether to take us in or to simply kill us right there and say that we had tried to escape. Well, finally, fortunately, the what I call the voice of reason prevailed, and they decided to take us in. So when we finally got to the police station, they started interrogation. They had two detectives come in, and they had a tape recorder, and they kept asking me questions. And, well, the first thing I said is I wanted my phone call. Everybody knows you're entitled to a phone call if you get arrested. And they laughed at me. And they said, oh, that's just on television. Actually, we can hold you for 72 hours without giving you a phone call, and by then, we might lose you in the basement. And by then, I knew they could do whatever they wanted. Nobody would know. So the questioning continued, and every time I said, but you're trying to get me to say something that's not true, they'd stop the recording, and they'd start again. And this went on until finally in the early evening, this happened in the morning, they did say I could have a phone call, and I tried to call my parents, of course, and they weren't home, so I left a wonderful message. And then it continued. At one point, they took me to test my hands to see if I had fired a gun. And on the way back from the test, I heard my son call my name. And I broke away from the policewoman. I ran down the hall, and there was my 9-year-old son sitting on a bench by himself crying. And he said, "Mommy, they keep asking me questions and I don't know what to say." And I said, "You don't have to say anything to them. You just tell them you want your grandma and your grandpa." And then I said, "I love you." And she took me away. So I knew at that point that my children weren't being safely held by social services, that in fact, my son was being questioned the same as I was. And I found out later that they even tested both children for gun residue. So this questioning went on until about 10:30 at night, when a lawyer showed up at the jail and insisted on speaking to me and said he wouldn't leave until he did. Because all that day, the reports were on the news, on the television, the radio, about this terrible thing that happened, and they mentioned my name. And my friends heard this and they thought, something has to be wrong here, because she doesn't even eat meat. How's she going to be killing people? So they got in touch with the lawyer and said to them, "They've been looking for me all day and been told that they didn't know where I was." So that's why he personally came at 10:30 at night. And at that point, of course, the questioning stopped, and I was finally booked into the jail at 12:30, after midnight. All during this time, when Jesse and I were being interrogated, the man who actually did the killing from his hospital bed had requested to see the prosecutor, because he knew that he was facing the electric chair for killing policemen. So he wanted to make a deal. And the prosecutor, I later understood, saw this as an opportunity to enhance his reputation, because he wanted to run for the office of district attorney, and saw this as a way to show his strong stance on crime and get 3 convictions instead of 1. So he made a deal with the killer, and he was to get 3 life sentences in exchange for his testimony against Jesse. Okay, well, I thought, when I heard about this deal, I thought, okay, this is a no-brainer. Let's go to court, because anybody who thinks 3 life sentences is a bargain is obviously guilty, because no innocent person would do that. In my naivete, because I had never experienced a criminal trial, and I didn't know how it goes, but actually the jury wasn't allowed to know about his plea bargain. So, and also, my children were held in custody. My daughter, the baby, the 10-month-old, was held for 2 weeks until finally, when my parents heard about what happened, they were able to get a hold of her, get a judge to release her into their custody. But my son was held for over 2 months in juvenile detention, when he was kept in isolation because of his age. And when my parents were finally able to get a judge to release him into their custody, he was so traumatized by being taken to hearings, unrepresented, handcuffed behind his back, repeatedly, that he had to be put in a special school. He couldn't remember how to read and do math, and he developed a speech impediment that to this day, if he gets nervous, he'll stutter. And all because of that. So Jesse went to trial first. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in 4 days, solely on the testimony of the man who actually did it. Me, it was a little bit more difficult with me, because like I said, I was kind of a hippie, mother of 2 children, vegetarian, so I mean, it wasn't as easy to convict me. I had no prior record of anything. And so in the second week of my trial, after carting this guy into court to say whatever he said, that he didn't do it, we did, they brought in a young woman who had been arrested for a minor drugs charge. She was in university. She and her boyfriend had been arrested, and they told her that if she could help them to convict me, she and her boyfriend would be released the following day. If not, she would go to prison for a long time she would never get back to university and her life would be ruined. So she showed up in my trial, and she said that in the one night that they placed her in the same cell block as I was in, that I talked to her, and I told her that I did it, and I enjoyed it, and I would do it again. And I thought, okay, this is totally ridiculous. Now the jury will surely know that this is not true. And they weren't convinced, actually, and they started asking questions of the judge. But the judge, who had been a former highway patrolman before he was a judge and refused to recuse himself from our cases, explained the law in such a way that they felt that they had no recourse but to convict on what they had been told in court. Because my court-appointed lawyer said we didn't need to put up a defense. Why would we have to put up a defense? There was not a fingerprint, there was nothing, absolutely nothing to connect me to what had happened except that I was there. And so he said it would give him a better position in the closing arguments if we didn't put up a defense. Fine. He's the lawyer. No, I wasn't worried about it. It was ridiculous. So I now advise anyone who's accused of anything to take a stand, because otherwise they think you have something to hide and you're not defending yourself. In any case, as a result of the judge's explanation of the law, the jurors felt that they had no choice but to convict me. But when it came to the sentencing phase, one juror in particular was not convinced. He didn't even think I should have been convicted, and he certainly wasn't going to allow himself to be bullied into agreeing to give me the death penalty. And I know this because many years later, this man was so troubled by his experience in my trial that he made it a point to come and find me. And he told me what happened in the jury room. He said they tried to get him to agree to sentence me to death because, number one, they wanted to make an example of a woman, to show that if you come to Florida and you kill somebody in our state, you will get the death penalty. Number two was because I was writing notes all during the trial, because my court-appointed lawyer said that I mustn't ask a lot of questions during trial because it would interrupt the proceedings, and he would tell me later, which he never did. And the third reason was, and they were mad at me for that because they thought I was going to write a book and make a lot of money off the crime. And the third reason was because they were tired and hungry and wanted to go home after being sequestered for 2 weeks. Anyway, this man refused to be bullied into going along with the rest, and he actually saved my life. It proves that one person can make a difference. It was as a result of his courageous stand on his own principles that they weren't able to be unanimous, and therefore they weren't able to give me the death penalty. They had to sentence me to life. But the judge overruled them. In some states in America they can do that. And he decided to overrule the jury and give me death anyway. Now when they do that, they have to give a proper legal written reason for doing so. And he didn't. He just sentenced me to death. And so they took me to the women's maximum security prison, and they cleared out an entire building where they used to people, like if there was a riot in the prison or if they had a number of prisoners to lock up for behavior reasons. And they completely emptied the building, and that's where they put me. In one cell, there were 6 cells on each side of the building. I was kept at the far end of the building in a cell that had been specially prepared for me as my personal death row. There were no other women with a sentence of death at the time. So I was kept in complete isolation, in solitary confinement. The guards, like in Peter's case, were under instructions not to speak to me. My cell had a solid metal door with a small opening through which they could observe me every hour, 24 hours a day. They would come, peep in the window, and write down what I was doing. I only got out of my cell twice a week for a brief shower, and then maybe 15 minutes outside in a prison uniform, and then the guard, and no one was allowed to interact with me during that time. Then the guard would bring me back in, they'd give me my white pajamas with my number, because they take away your name. And I'd spend another 3 or 4 days in my cell waiting to be let out again. That was it. I spent 5 years in solitary confinement under sentence of death. And in the beginning, I was so angry and so confused and afraid that they actually could have come in at any time. I mean, this does happen sometimes when people are in jail. All of a sudden they found them hung in their cell and nobody knows what. They could easily have done that to me. No one would know. There wasn't another soul in the building to say what happened. And so I spent the first weeks in that state of fear and anger and confusion, pacing the 6 steps in my cell, back and forth between the door and the toilet, until finally I basically just got disgusted. I started to lose my own concept of who I was and what I looked like, and I was starting to feel kind of hopeless. But I was only allowed 2 books, a law book, which was incomprehensible to me at the time, and the Bible. So I would read the Bible every day. I just opened it to any page, and it was a book of wisdom, and it always seemed to tell me something I needed to hear. And on this one particular occasion, it told me that they don't really get to say when I die. And I realized that I did have a choice, that I could either choose to believe in hopelessness and that they were just going to, I was just there waiting for them to kill me, or I could choose to believe in hope, which meant that I would choose to believe that there was God, that there's something out there that could help me, and that not only wasn't I alone, but that until they did either realize that they made a big mistake and let me go home, or came to kill me for some reason of my karma that I didn't understand, my life still belonged to me. I might not be able to leave that cell, but within the cell, it was up to me how I led my life until that day came, whatever day that was. And so I decided that the best thing I could do with my time there would be to make myself the best person I could be and do my spiritual work. Because after all, I was excused from work. I didn't have to pay for my electricity. They gave me free electricity. I didn't have to pay for my food. They fed me, they cooked for me, they cleaned for me, they did my dishes, they did my laundry. Why, for the first time in my life, I had servants. And so I decided to turn my cell into a sanctuary. And I every morning would get up and do my yoga, meditation, and prayers. And then I made rules for myself. I decided I would never be bored. I'd never count the bricks in the wall. I could do mathematics in my head. I could think of recipes to feed my children when I went home. And so that's how I decided that I would live my life. I didn't have to live in fear and confusion and anger. And so I really learned more, I think, about freedom during the time I was sentenced to death than I ever knew before. After 5 years, they changed my sentence from death to life because the judge had illegally changed my sentence. And also because my court-appointed lawyer said he wasn't prepared to talk about the death penalty. So my sentence then changed from death to life, which I thought was great because then I could be outside with other people and eat with people and talk to people. And I lost my voice totally after 3 days because I talked so much when I first got into the population. And I could call my children on the telephone. All during those 5 years, I was never allowed a phone call. We just got letters. And my parents could only bring the children 4 times a year, school holidays and summer. So it was very difficult. My daughter didn't even know me as her mother. She was just a baby when we were separated. And my son, it was really hard when they bring him to visit because he would cry and he'd say he wanted to stay with me in my cell. It was very, very difficult. But at least now I could use the phone, I could call them. Visiting was a lot better. My parents didn't have to worry about me being executed. And I could go outside, and I got a little paint set, and I used to paint the sunsets and write my letters to Jesse on that, so I could share that with him. But about a year after my sentence was changed from death to life, my parents, being so relieved that they didn't have to worry about me being executed, decided to take one holiday that didn't involve coming to prison. And unfortunately, their plane crashed. And they were killed. So then my children became orphans again. And they went into care, to foster care. And I became an orphan too. And that meant there was no one out there to send me some money so I could get things in prison, or to make sure that someone was looking at me. I was very fortunate that there were pro bono lawyers who took up my case, because they believed in my innocence. Without pro bono lawyers, nobody that I know who's been wrongly convicted would be free. Nobody. Because who do they choose to do this to? People who have no funds, people who can't defend themselves. And once you're in prison, then you certainly have no way of paying a lawyer. So fortunately, these two young lawyers took up my case. And I say, fortunately, they were young because it took 17 years. So if you don't get a young lawyer, they'll probably pass away before they get to finish your appeal, which actually happened to me. We don't have enough time to tell you about that. And so the pro bono lawyers took up my case. After 11 years, we were able to locate the young woman who had lied at my trial, and she confessed and told the whole thing, which is how I know what happened with her. But the judge ruled that it was her word, former drug addict, against the prosecutor, upstanding citizen. So we didn't prevail. A number of times the killer actually confessed, bragging to other prisoners about how he killed the policeman and had us on death row for what he did. And even at one point, a couple of the inmates came forward, and we had a court hearing, and we were sure we were going home. But again, they ruled prisoner's word isn't believable. Only when they testify against you it was believable, but not when they testify for you. So again, we didn't prevail. In the 15th year of incarceration, Jesse received his third death warrant, which is normally fatal, and in his case it was. And they took him to the electric chair, and they put this metal helmet on them, and then they attach electrodes to their body, and they strap them in the chair. But inside this helmet is supposed to be a natural sea sponge to conduct the electricity. But in Jesse's case, I'm told they did this because they felt that he wouldn't suffer enough to just be executed. So they substituted the natural sea sponge with an artificial sea sponge, which doesn't conduct the electricity properly. So that when they sent the electricity into the helmet, instead of dying, Jesse caught fire. And the witnesses who were there said that flames shot into the air and smoke came out from underneath, from his ears, and that it took him 13 and a half minutes to finally die after having this done to him 3 times. They stopped using the electric chair after Jesse's execution. And when our daughter, who by then was 15 years old, heard about what happened to her father and the way it happened, she tried to take her own life. And so the foster family didn't know what to do, and there's no help for the children of people on death row. And so they sent her away to a school for children with behavioral and emotional problems, and she was locked up until she was 18 years old. So, about 2.5 years after Jesse's execution, finally, with the help of the pro bono lawyers and a childhood friend of mine who just never believed that I could possibly have been guilty, and she had become a documentary filmmaker, so she had different research skills than the lawyers. The lawyers tend to do things in a linear way, and she kind of did things in a more circular way. And so between them, they were able to put together a habeas corpus, this time with diagrams. They had to get special permission to put diagrams in. It was actually the first time anyone had done that. And as a result, we won my habeas corpus. But like Peter, I wasn't released. Oh no, because now they were going to be responsible for wrongful conviction, and they would have to give me compensation. And then there was Jesse to think about. Because what happened was, in proving my innocence, it also proved that Jesse couldn't have done it either. So they threatened to take me back to a new trial, and there were hearings, and in the course of the hearings, my friends said to the lawyers, why should we believe anything they said or did? I mean, they lied about it so much, so they didn't take anything for granted. There was a report submitted before the trials that the man that had testified against us, the actual killer, had taken a polygraph test because they had to give him a polygraph test in order to justify giving him the plea bargain, to prove that they weren't giving it to the actual killer. And they submitted this report that said he passed the lie detector test. So my friend said, but why should we believe the report? Let's see, we want to see the actual graph that came off the machine, you know. And so they hired an ex-policeman who was now a polygraph expert, so they couldn't say he was on my side. And he examined the graph, and sure enough, he found that he failed the lie detector test. He didn't pass the lie detector test. When he said he didn't do it, we did, he failed. But they had submitted a false report. Well, that should have been enough, shouldn't it? But it wasn't. So they continued the hearings, and then they discovered in these 10 boxes that they were given of further discovery that we had never seen. And I think that the prosecution gave them the 10 boxes because they figured no lawyer would ever have time to go through 10 boxes of material. And the lawyers didn't have time. But my friends rented a room, and they took those 10 boxes, and they went through every paper, and whenever they saw something that referred to something they didn't know about, they questioned it. We found out that there was a statement made by a prison guard who had overheard this man bragging about how he had killed a policeman and blamed us for it. And he had made a written statement that had been hidden from us. We never knew it existed. Had we known before Jesse's execution, Jesse would have been entitled to a new trial. He wouldn't have been executed. That was enough to stop the hearings. And then there were some negotiations, and eventually I was released. So I went to prison. I was 27 years old, a young mother, a wife, and a daughter. When I was released, I was a widow, an orphan, and a grandmother, because my 9-year-old son had a 3.5-year-old daughter of his own, and I was 45 years old. 45 from 27. That whole part of my life was just gone. And I was supposed to be a grandmother, and like I didn't even know how. Like I was still thinking of myself as a young person. And I had no idea of how to operate in the world. The world had changed so much in 17 years. So they actually, all I had in the world, when they released me, I had no money, just like Peter. I had nothing, not a penny in my pocket. I had no identification. I had this little cardboard box of everything I owned in the world, which was 2 pairs of jeans, 2 white shirts, 2 pairs of shoes, and 6 pairs of underwear, and a Walkman radio. And all the little writings that I had done all through the years. That's all I owned in the whole world. I had no home to go back to. My parents were gone. So my friends, they took me to visit my son and meet my granddaughter. And then I went to see my daughter, who was still locked up in that school. And I could only hope that her curiosity would lead her to me one day. And then I went with my friends with the assurance that I could always go back to my son's house. He said I could always have a home with him. But he was living way out in the country because he had lost all faith in society. And I really wanted to see a little bit more of the world. And my friends asked me if I wanted to come to live with them in Los Angeles. And I was like, oh, that's Disneyland. So I went out to LA with them. And I lived with them for quite a while because I had no else where to go. And no one would hire me because, well, what work record did I have? Anyway, was to hire a 45-year-old woman, you know, in the starting position. So I decided I would do what I had done in prison that got me through all the most difficult years of my life there. Because you see, being released, oh great, it's freedom, but freedom isn't free. I mean, how was I going to eat? I didn't have any money. They don't just feed you. And so I got myself a job doing teaching yoga, because that's what I knew how to do. And that's what got me through the most difficult parts of my life before. So yoga, do your stuff again. And it did. So I did my yoga and my meditation and prayers. And eventually my daughter got out of the school and she did come to me. We did get an apartment together, and it took us like 4 different tries before we got it right, because I had lost the right to be her mom. You know, she called me her birth mother, but I would take whatever I could get. But eventually we worked that out, and then sometime later my son's marriage broke up, and he came with his daughter to live with us. So we all were family again, except for I was the littlest one by then. And I realized that it was most important for me, for my own healing, not only to practice yoga and meditation and prayer, but also forgiveness. Because without forgiveness, I wouldn't have room inside me for love and happiness and joy and healing. And that wasn't the legacy that I wanted to leave my children either, my grandchildren. I wanted to leave them a legacy of hope, and to know absolutely that when life knocks you down, you can choose. You have a choice, and you can choose to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and move forward and forgive whatever you have to forgive, so that you can open yourself up to a beautiful life. Or you can choose to be miserable and think about the worst things that happened to you in your life, and you certainly have the right to do so. But me, I choose happiness. And so, my daughter eventually found a nice man and had 2 children of her own, to whom she gave the childhood she never had. My son found love on the internet, and he met a woman in Australia. And he moved there with his daughter, and they combined their families and have a nice life. And then that left me free to follow my own path again, and I became an activist against the death penalty and for human rights. And marching through Texas, I met some people from Amnesty Ireland, and they invited me to come to Ireland. And I was so excited about that, that I told, when we marched through Tennessee, after that I told a friend named Steve Earle, who is a famous folk singer in America, and he said, having been to Ireland, well, when you go to Ireland, you got to meet Peter Pringle. And I said, okay. And so he didn't tell me anything about Peter. And that's why I called Peter when I got there. And he came to my talk. And he still didn't tell me a thing about what had happened to him, until finally the next day when he was taking me sightseeing. And I asked him, what is your interest in the death penalty anyway? And he told me, and then he told me about the yoga and meditation. And I knew This was meant to be. Peter, come on up here with me. We finish up together. And so we actually became part of each other's healing because Peter also decided not only on yoga and meditation, but on forgiveness. And so that's when we realized that we have to help others as our way of giving back for the blessings that we've had in our life. So we started the Sony Center, and we bring people not just from the United States. We've had people from Britain. We've had people from, from Ireland, Scotland. We have somebody waiting from Malta. We have somebody coming from Uganda. We have had inquiries from India, and I mean, it's just amazing. The Congo, it's extraordinary because this is a problem everywhere, you see, and anywhere they have the death penalty, most especially. So that's what we do, and it's really been a gift to us to be able to do that. And we hope that each of you will explore the possibilities of what you can do in that area. And Amicus is a great place to start. They have their training actually this weekend. And what they do is they train young lawyers or law students to go over and help with death cases. And it's not just innocent ones, it's any death cases. Because, well, we just don't believe in the death penalty, period. We've got to be able to do better than that as a society. You know, and the lesson that teaches the young people is that, you know, if you annoy us enough, we'll just kill you. Yeah. I don't think that's the right lesson at all. I just think we can do better than that. So thank you very much for listening to us. And
I've heard that speech talk many times over a decade. I think these two, and I'm sure you agree with me that you've never been failed to be moved by their absolutely fantastic, inspirational talk. I always forget and I always remember when I listen to a talk about how positive these two are and to get through what they've come through. They are going to take questions, so if you do have any questions, please do ask any question at all. Or if you prefer to have a one-to-one, I'm sure we'll take questions privately afterwards.
sure.
Does anybody have any questions now? Anyone brave enough?
Oh, good. Go ahead.
In the end, did you get any compensation at the very end?
No, nothing. That's what the whole thing was about in the end, was to make sure that I couldn't get compensation by this threat of the new trial and the negotiations afterwards. They do that quite often.
I opened a case against the state over what they did to me, and I opened it in October 1995. I came out in May 95. I opened it in October 95. I'm still waiting for a hearing. In 2002, we were told there was going to be a hearing, and when we went to the High Court in Dublin, we were told there wasn't a judge available that day to hear the case. So I went from the top of the list back to the bottom of the list.
We'll have to make answers, really should. But unfortunately, people only hear about the cases that did get compensation. It's only about, I think, 4% of the people who are wrongfully convicted that are acquitted. 4%, the rest get nothing, and they live in terrible poverty. In fact, there are suicides among the exonerees because they just can't manage. It's very sad. Yeah. One guy came to us at the Sunny Center, we had to get him teeth. He didn't have any teeth. We're so sad.
Another man came to us, he'd spent 34 years in prison. On death row. Went in at 17 years of age.
He was in his 50s.
And so he was in his 50s when he was with us. And we noticed he had difficulty eating. And he would never, he wore a hat. He'd even wear it at the table. And he'd keep his head down so you couldn't see his mouth. In the time he was in prison, in death row, he'd been, in his sleep, he'd been gnashing his teeth. And his top row of teeth were worn so much down that he had hardly no teeth at all.
Yeah,
and there was no way for him to get looked after when he came out of prison because he had no money and the authorities wouldn't give him any help. We're presently seeking, we we have a friend who thinks he can get a dentist to do the work for him.
Actually, what we do is just want to tell you so that you know. At the center, we not only take in exonerees or guests, but we have volunteers that come. You have to be able to spend a month at least with us, and they work with us, they help us at the center, and more often than not, there'll be an exoneree there as our guest, and the volunteer helps them to learn how to socialize again, because they come out of prison, and they have this huge stigma. Even though they were exonerated, there are still people who think, yeah, right, and they have a very hard time fitting in, like Peter said. And so the volunteers not only help us with the animals and everything else, but they also help them to learn to be comfortable talking to someone again, and it's a very interesting process. We, in our present circumstances, we only have the exonerees for 2 weeks at a time. We used to keep them for a month. But during that 2 weeks, the first week, they spend just talking. And we listen. And the second week, we share with them our experiences that helped us through the difficulties that they're facing. And they know they don't have to pretend that it's okay, because they know that we know it's not. So, you want to tell me a little more about that, what we do?
Yeah, we're actually expecting to get a young man to come to us who was arrested at 14 years of age for a crime he didn't commit. 14 years of age.
In Los Angeles.
And spent 8 years in prison before his innocence was proved.
8?
Yeah, he was 24 or 25.
Oh yeah, that guy might be.
Yeah, but visualize this if you would. Imagine this situation, and it's a true situation. Visualize somebody at, say, 16, 17 years of age who's wrongly convicted and sentenced to death for a rape or murder. They didn't commit. Who spends maybe 20 to 30 years in prison, sometimes on death row, before his conviction is overturned and he's exonerated. He gets out of prison, he has no money, he has no help. He gets social assistance, which just about pays his rent in the cheapest possible hovel you can imagine. He lives in abject poverty, he gets food stamps. We had one man who came and he thought he was living very well because he would go to Walmart and buy the cheapest tins of vegetables he could get. And as long as he could see that this contains vitamin B or vitamin C, if they put on it, he thought that was healthy eating.
But about it being convicted of rape and then...
Imagine the plight of this young man. He comes back out now, he's now in his 50s. He never had a relationship. He's been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death for a rape murder. He's terrified of women. He's terrified to speak to a woman. Because he's afraid that he might say the wrong thing, or somebody might accuse him in the wrong again, and he might face the same situation. It's horrific. And so we take them out and we bring them to places, bring them to the theatre, we bring them to meet friends, we bring them to events. And it's quite extraordinary to see such a man in the company of women who just talk to him as an ordinary human being, and to see how gradually, instead of going around like this, he's able to sort of open up and smile and be himself and realise that he's worthy. He's a worthy human being. And to see that blossom in him, I tell you, it's absolutely priceless. It brings me to tears even to think about it.
We try to help them find an identity beyond just being an exoneree. Being a photographer, or a jewelry maker, or a musician.
Whatever it happens to be, whatever their talent is, we try to encourage them to develop their own creative talents, whatever they may be, because they're not going to get work. Not in the United States particularly. Not anywhere for that matter. I mean, what do? You go along to a company and they ask you, fill in your CV, where were you for the last 30 years? In prison. But I didn't commit the crime and I was exonerated. Yeah, goodbye, thank you very much. You're not going to get a job. So they're condemned to poverty.
Are there any other questions?
Well, can I, just on that point, can I just, there is a website.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can see.
When I went to North Carolina, the attorney I worked with worked closely with an exoneree called Darrell Hunt.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And Darrell Hunt set up a similar organisation trying to support people who have come out of prison and been exonerated. And even though he spent the rest of his life trying to be positive, very, very unfortunate, Darrell very recently committed suicide. And so the pains of even his time in death penalty, even though he was doing positive work, still lived with him, and the trauma still lived with him. And so all I can do, just knowing from that experience, is commend this, from my, whatever it's worth, my opinion, commend this centre, and whatever support or awareness you can do to help Peter and Sonny in that process, please do. Because it's, as you can hear, they're on a very unfortunate path. Even though they have the freedom, still have an uphill struggle.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions?
Any other questions? Legal or otherwise?
Don't be shy. There's a lady there.
Did anything happen to the judges or the senior officers that wrongly committed?
I'm sorry, you need to speak
Did
up.
anything happen to the prosecutors
No.
in either case? No, and it doesn't. I only know of one case, I think it was in Texas, where the prosecutor was punished in some way, minor way,
Yeah, he was sentenced to 5 days in prison.
suspended.
You've just heard prosecutors are
Part
elected.
of the problem.
They're elected in America, and so you have to appear to be tough on crime, or you have to run your political campaign to try and get votes. You've already heard prosecution misconduct is an appeal point, but no more than that. And even then, it's quite hard to get, as you said, then finally released.
Right, and then there's no punishment. I mean, there's no accountability. After my trial, he said, well, if I had known it was going to be an appellate point, I would have told him about it. Oh, so I think that the whole law needs to be, I think it needs to be handled differently. I think that the collection of evidence should be distributed equally among the defense and the prosecution. As it stands, and it's in Ireland too, and I think here too, the police gather all the evidence, and then they hand it over to the prosecution. And the prosecution decides what they need to give to the defense. That you wouldn't even play cards under those circumstances. You know, hey, come on, I'll look at all the cards. I'll give you some. Now let's play. How much do you want to bet? I mean, that's crazy. And they're not betting your own lives, they're betting somebody else's, so it doesn't matter. So I think that's a big, big problem in the way the law and the trials are conducted.
In fairness, though, I should say that when a high-profile crime happens and a team of police officers, detectives are assigned to investigate it, they're put under huge pressure to get results. They're under pressure from the superiors, they're under pressure from the political establishment, and they're under pressure from the media. They're not under pressure to get justice, they're under pressure to get results. And so if they find, if there's one of them that's a bit bent or otherwise and decides that with a little bit of manipulation, a little bit of twisting here and there, they can get a conviction, they'll go for the conviction. And if they get the conviction, then they've got results and they're lauded for it, and they get promotion. And they see this is a good way to work, so they keep getting promotion. And in my own case, for example, the police officers who perjured themselves in the court were all promoted. And 2 police officers who refused to perjure themselves in court were never promoted.
There's a Center for Prosecutorial Integrity now in America. It's great, it's really great, because it's made up of prosecutors who want to try to prevent wrongful convictions. And they're pushing for a to have interrogation based on not on thinking the person is guilty, but an interrogation based on the possibility that the person might be innocent. So it's called, that's the interrogation based on guilt is called victim-centered interrogation, where it's trying to actually prove you're guilty, whereas they really should be trying to find out the truth, not just trying to prove that you're guilty. So that the presumption of innocence should still apply until
You're
you're
proven
actually
guilty.
guilty.
It's a lovely concept. But, you know, there are moves certain moves, they're small, they're happening. For example, last summer, at the end of the summer, we had a visit from a district attorney from the United States who came to see us because he wanted to see the work we were doing, and who had organised a meeting with his local Innocence Project, where 19 prosecutors got together with the local Innocence Project to discuss this whole question of wrongful conviction. So there is a certain movement towards change. Now, what's going to happen in the present situation with the lunatic that they're saying now remains to be seen.
Anyway, any other
Okay,
questions?
yes, dear.
I know that you guys have mentioned that you were heavily influenced by yoga and meditation, and like this kind of coincides with like positive psychology. Like, have you guys felt that psychology has ever been involved in your cases, or like the Sunny Centre as well?
We actually work with a man who is, I think, you could say, the world's leading expert on having been a hostage or having been wrongfully imprisoned. He's of Cambridge, and he does Skype sessions with our guests if they want. And in fact, one of them spent, I think it was at least 2 hours on a Skype call with him, and once they return home, they can continue that therapeutic sessions with him. So we do make use of that, although the major part of the work really is them being with someone that they know really knows because they've been there. It's kind of like based on the AA, you know, the Alcoholics Anonymous kind of thing, where it takes one to help one. So we're trying to actually set up other centers because we can't possibly help enough people, just, you know, us with what we have to work with. And so we're trying to work with other exonerees to train them to be able to do this, and then open up centers in the US and here and in other places where it's needed. That's one of the places was the Congo. We've been invited to try to train some people to do it there. So it's kind of an amazing, huge task. And we also found that we need a break in between too, because it's so intense and it brings back so much. You know, you can't help but empathize. We know exactly. And when they just spill it all out, and we actually need time to recover ourselves. Occasionally, I make a call and say, I think I need a session now, you know. And not only that, but the children of the people who are fortunate enough to have had children before they had this happen to them, those children need help too. For the first time, my daughter has agreed to come with us to a conference, an Innocence Project conference, and she's 40 now. And she's still dealing with the after effects. So.
I would just like to say something too. Yoga and meditation has been a powerful help to us. I can't recommend them strongly enough. Sunny teaches yoga today, not today, but regularly. Every week he teaches yoga, and I go to yoga class. We meditate together every day.
Yeah.
And when exonerees come to us, we encourage them to meditate, because it's helping them to go into their inner being and heal. Okay. Anybody else?
Actually, the first part of the therapy is the animals. As soon as the person comes in, either one of the dogs or cat, or occasionally the goat, becomes their
soulmates, you know, they just identify. And quite often you'll see guys sitting on the sofa with one dog on each side, you know, the two dogs on each side of them. And it's bliss, because for maybe 30 years he hasn't experienced anything like this.
love. It's the one big.
The one thing
piece
that's missing, there's no love in prison.
And when they get out, there's no love either. Their family is completely estranged from them. They, you know, in most cases, they don't know. They were embarrassed. I mean, you know, it's very embarrassing to have someone in your family accused of murder or rape and murder or whatever. And, you know, my family had to move when after it happened. It was terrible. And so you come out and, you know, even if they did try to believe in you, they've moved on. You're not part of their lives anymore. So it's very hard to, there's no love. And so the first thing you see is with the animals, they just open up, it just, little light shines through, and then we just build on that. So it's a really beautiful process to be part of, but it's very stressful. So we learn to take breaks in between ourselves.
We have to, if we're going to keep working.
We're traumatized too. It's very traumatic. But at least they can see that, at the very least, we give them hope that maybe they can find love and happiness again too, and by using the tools that we give them. So.
Okay, well,
That's
on
about
that
what we
positive note of love, I think we'll end.
Yeah.
We will be outside. Sam obviously is performing in turn. He's in touch with New Orleans. Any questions, feel free to ask myself or come and speak to people.
And we'll come up to where the books are.
Yeah. Okay. If you can just thank people.